the Director of Principal Gifts for JTS in Florida, and I want to welcome you all to this new learning spearheaded by your fearless leader, Shirley Cohn. So Shirley, thank you for putting this group together. Sorry about the technical challenges in getting us started. We're going to begin in just a minute. You will probably want to adjust your Zoom settings so you're watching the active speaker mode. And without further ado, I'm going to welcome Rabbi Matt Berkowitz, who is joining us from Jerusalem. Good morning, Matt.
Good afternoon, Carolyn. Almost good evening here. Great to see you, Carolyn, and great to see the whole group with us. So I want to echo Carolyn's thanks, do some hakarat hatov, acknowledging the great blessing of Shirley Cohen. Shirley, thank you so much for your proactivity in organizing this group and being our hostess. You are truly the hostess with the mostest. And I want to say that in taking this initiative, Shirley, you recognize that this is not only a time of turning inward and taking family, but it's also a time of turning outward as well and gathering community and reconnecting with our community. So I can't thank you enough for reaching out, organizing this learning together. It's so beautiful to be a part of a virtual Beit Midrash that spans the great ocean as I sit here in Jerusalem and all of you there in South Florida. So, so thank you for participating. I also want to thank, of course, Carolyn Cantor, JTS's director in South Florida, for all of your support and logistical work on this, as well as Dorit Rabbani, Tina Wang, and Ronnie Summer. Ronnie, who is our administrative assistant in the JTS Florida office. So thank you all for making this happen. It truly takes a village. So I see there are still a few that are logging in as I speak. So let me just begin with sort of big picture where it is that we're going to go. So I am, for those of you who do not know me, it's very beautiful to see some new faces here. I am JTS's Jewish Theological Seminary's Director of Israel Programs based in Jerusalem. And in that capacity, what I do is I work with rabbinical and cantorial students that come to study in Israel for the year. I have responsibility for both their academic and experiential learning over the course of the year. Most important detail is that I made Aliyah, came to move to Israel from the other Jerusalem of Boca Raton, Florida, where many of you are sitting right now, and that was 11 years ago. It's hard to believe that it's been that long. Every day is another adventure here in Israel. And I hope and pray that I can welcome you all to Israel very, very soon, and that this mess of ours will be over b'mehira b'yameinu very, very quickly in our day. So what we're going to be doing over the course of the next 6 weeks is we're going to be participating in a 6-part series. That series will begin at 10 in the morning and run for approximately hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half. The title of...
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second, Rabbi Berkowitz. We're going to go ahead and mute everyone's microphones so that you can hear Rabbi Berkowitz, and then about midway, we'll take questions and we'll unmute the mics again. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. So the title of this series should say the scroll of Ruth, to be more precise. So I mentioned the title of the class as a way of saying to all of you that there is no such that you ask questions. Don't be shy to ask your questions. And I can assure you that whatever question that you're thinking of, somebody else in this Beit Midrash, in the study hall of ours, is also thinking of that question. So I want you to make a note of it. And what we're going to do in about 45 minutes or so is we're going to take a pause midway so that I could take any questions that you have. And then about 15 minutes before we end, we'll also take some questions. Okay, so just jot down the questions as we move ahead. Also, if there's something that I mention that you don't understand in the moment, raise your hand. Just give me a signal and we will call on you. I want to hear what your question is. Stop me in my tracks, don't be shy. I want you to feel, completely invested in the learning that we're going to be doing. So I said the title of the class is Counting the Omer, Counting Our Blessings, Parsha Inspiration, the Book of Ruth. So there are at least 3 questions that you should be asking yourself about the title of this class. First of all, what is the Omer? And what does it mean to count the Omer? Would anyone like to answer that before I jump in? I see a hand up. Alan, you just have to unmute.
The Omer is the quantity or counting of 7 weeks until the harvest. The barley and wheat harvest take place in the land of Israel.
Very good. Okay, perfect. Beautifully said. Okay, so we begin counting the Omer in the Jewish calendar from the 2nd night of Passover. Okay, and that takes us 49 days until the holiday of Shavuot. Okay, we all are familiar with the holiday of Passover, in which we retell the story of the Exodus. Less familiar to the Jewish world is the holiday of Shavuot. And I would submit to you that Shavuot, the festival of Shavuot, is the most important festival of the year for Jews. And why do I say that? I say that because Shavuot celebrates the giving of Torah. Right? It's on Shavuot that we receive Torah at Sinai, and we are celebrating that moment on the day of Shavuot. And it's a tradition that the evening of Shavuot, we stay up all night and we learn Torah together, okay? So over the course of this time in the calendar, we are counting those 49 days. In addition, I mentioned the word Parsha. Parsha refers to the weekly Torah reading. And then finally, Megillat Ruth, the story of Ruth. The story of Ruth, which is connected to the holiday of Shavuot. And that is why we chose that as the core text that we're going to be studying over these 6 weeks, okay, the scroll of Ruth. I'll say more about the scroll of Ruth and the background in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to turn to the Parsha. When I spoke about this class with Shirley, she asked me if I could give a bit of inspiration on the weekly Torah reading at each class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to vary it a bit. Sometimes I'm going to begin with that inspiration, and sometimes I'm going to conclude. Okay, this afternoon, or I should say this morning for you all, I am going to begin with some inspiration from this Parsha. And this week, we have a combination of 2 Torah readings. And those Torah readings are taken from the middle, the heart of the book of Leviticus. They are known as Tazria Mitzorah. Okay, Tazria concerns itself with issues of ritual impurity related to a woman who gives birth to a child, and Mitzorah deals with leprosy. Okay, so these are not the most engaging of parashot, and not the most engaging of Torah readings. In fact, when I was a senior in rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary, it was a tradition that we gave our senior sermon on a particular parsha, and I love to say that I hit the lottery. This was the parsha, this was the Torah reading that I ended up with. And typically when we get to the book of Leviticus, this is a time that many Jews tune out in the synagogue, right? Because the book of Leviticus deals with issues of purity, impurity, sacrifices, what we call korbanot in Hebrew, right? These are issues that are not particularly relevant to our lives today, and we have to dig a bit deeper. But what I want to say to you this morning is that it's truly uncanny that this happens to be the Torah reading that we're dealing with, because this Torah reading deals head on with illness and quarantine and the stigma of highly infectious disease, right? And the disease that the Parsha is talking about is leprosy. The book of Leviticus itself is consumed with the very, very clear distinction between life and death. And the problem with one who suffers from leprosy is that it crosses boundaries. That when one sees a leprous person, right, it's that gray area between life and death. In Parshat Mitzorah, it reads the following, which is taken from Leviticus chapter 13. As for the person of a leprous infection, his clothes will be torn, his head will be left bare, and he will cover over his upper lip. And here you thought wearing a mask was terrible, right? And what does he do? He goes out into the street and calls out, unclean, unclean. And then Torah says he will be unclean as long as the disease is on him. Being unclean, he will dwell apart. His dwelling will be outside the camp, right? That individual is placed in quarantine until healing begins. And then once the healing begins, there's a ritual of purification that the book of Leviticus describes. And it's absolutely fascinating, the ritual that's described, in which what it says is the priest shall take one of the male lambs and offer it with a log of oil as a guilt offering. And it goes on to describe the intricacies of the ritual that is done in order to bring somebody back into the community after the disease, after the illness has run its course. What's so fascinating is that this ritual resembles the ritual of the sacrifice, the sacrificial ceremony that's used for the ordination of the high priest. So think about that for a moment. What's so striking here is that essentially the ritual that is used for the holiest person in the community, that is the high priest, is also used to welcome back the most isolated person and to reintegrate that person into the community. As far as this business of the sick person going out into the street and yelling, unclean, unclean, it's both to signal that others should stay away from him lest they become infected, right? This is all sounding chillingly familiar to the world that we're living in now, right? But the other reason that the Talmud tells us he has to go out into the street and declare himself unclean is so that others will know of this person's suffering and they will pray for this person, right? What is so critical at this time, and this is very much where I began in singing Shirley's praises, is that this is a time not only about turning inward, this is about caring for family, this is about caring for community, this is about reaching out to others who are struggling in this crisis, whether they be elderly, whether they be sick and stuck in their homes. This is a time to really go out and make that gesture. It's a time to volunteer to do some food shopping for them, but it's also a time to be praying for them. And as I close with this teaching on the Parsha, I want to share with you a pandemic prayer that was written by the congregant of a conservative synagogue in Detroit, Michigan. His name is Roger Lemus. So I want to show you this very, very beautiful prayer that he wrote about a month ago. Okay, you can all see this on your screen. Just shake your head that you can see it. And okay, great, perfect. Thank you, Alan. I saw your thumb go up. Okay, a prayer for the pandemic. So here's what Roger wrote. His introduction: surely prayer is a fitting response to what we are facing. It traditionally has been appropriate to seek help in the face of great danger by prayers of supplication, those asking for divine assistance. And he writes that he wanted to compose a prayer that would be meaningful to the largest possible group of people. Okay, here is the prayer. O God, we turn to you at this time of peril, seeking your protection for us, our families, and all humanity. We ask that you heal in body and spirit all those in this country and throughout the world stricken by this terrible new plague. We ask that you strengthen and protect the nurses, doctors, and all others who are placing their own lives at risk to care for the sick. We pray for our leaders and their advisors at all levels of government and for all others who exercise just and rightful authority, asking that you give them insight, judgment, and compassion as they make the many decisions facing our country that need to be made now and in the future. We pray too that you will guide and grant wisdom to all who are tirelessly working to develop new medicines and vaccines to cure and protect against this virus, and ask for their success so that soon it may be defeated and this pandemic ended. And finally, we ask that you sustain and help all who, even though escaping illness, are finding their lives and the lives of their families in turmoil because of the consequences to our society of this disease. As we seek your assistance, support, and mercy, we say, Amen. Right, very, very beautiful prayer. And he goes on, he's got a prayer for specific individuals that you can also say as well. If you're interested in receiving this, please let us know. You can, in the chat section, you could send Carolyn Cantor your email address, and we'll be sure to send out the pandemic prayer. What I also want to say, because this is connected to the core of the learning that we're going to be doing with the Book of Ruth, is that Roger himself hails from Jacksonville, Florida, and he is a Jew by choice. And I really want to sing his praises on that level. And I also want to say that in this world in which we're living, I truly believe that it's not only converts that we're talking about that are Jews by choice, but that every single Jew is a Jew by choice. You have to do something proactive in order to take hold of this beautiful history and tradition that we have, in order to call yourself a Jew and to be proud of that association and that label. With that, let's turn to the heart of what we're doing, and that is Megillat Ruth. And as we enter this text, I asked you to read the first chapter of the Book of Ruth. I'm sure you saw that it's actually a very, very short text. It's only 4 chapters. I asked you to read the first chapter. Could you just raise your hand so I could see who did the homework? Great, fantastic. I'm very happy. Wonderful. So a note on engaging with Jewish texts. I'm sure we've got some seasoned learners of Jewish texts that are with us this morning, and some of you that are new to learning Jewish text. So I want to talk just a bit about this exercise of engaging with Jewish text and learning text. Ruth Sohn, who's one of the authors of a magnificent book called Reading Ruth, explains the difference between the literal meaning of a text, which in Hebrew is called pshat, and drash, which is the homiletical interpretation of the text. And Ruth Sohn, in her essay, writes that the pshat, the literal interpretation, is apparent on the surface of the page. But she points out that that literal interpretation is incomplete. What makes the text meaningful to people in changing life situations, what makes it a living text, is that we must infuse it with drash. We must infuse it with homiletical interpretation. That is the interpretation that comes from our hearts and our souls, not only the interpretation that comes from the classical commentators, not only the interpretation that comes from the rabbis. I want to try to share screen one more time with you to show you a quote from Nietzsche. Carolyn, if you could just let me know if you could see the text that I'm about to share when I share it. If you can't see it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply read the text to you. This text was written in 1886. Let's give it a shot. Can you see this, Carolyn?
It's starting to share screen.
The first paragraph begins, now 18 years. Do you see that?
I have my computer is still thinking.
Okay, I'm going to read the text, okay?
Okay.
The text I'm about to read for you was written by the great philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in his preface to Daybreak, which he wrote in the autumn of 1886. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because at its essence, this is what it means to interpret a text, and it gets at the heart of, for us, what it is to interpret Jewish texts. He writes the following: this preface is late, but not too late. What, after all, do fears matter? A book like this, a problem like this, is in no hurry. We both, I just as much as my book, are of lento, slowness. It is not for nothing that I have been a philologist. Perhaps I am a philologist still. A philologist, by the way, is one who studies words. That is to say, a teacher of slow reading. In the end, I also write slowly. Nowadays, it is not only my habit, it is also to my taste. No longer to write anything which does not reduce to despair every sort of man who is in. For philology is that venerable art which demands of its votaries one thing above all: to go aside, to take time still, to become slow. It is a goldsmith's art and connoisseurship of the word, which has nothing but delicate, cautious work to do nothing if it does not achieve it lento, slowly. But for precisely this reason, it is more necessary than ever today. By precisely this means does it entice us and enchant us the most in the midst of an age of work, that is to say, of hurry, of indecent and perspiring haste, which wants to get everything done at once, including every old or new book. This art does not so easily get anything done. It teaches to read well, that is to read slowly, deeply, looking cautiously before and after, with reservations, with doors left open, with delicate eyes and delicate fingers. I am back. Okay, you all heard Nietzsche, correct? Yes. Okay, remember, he wrote that in 1886, and in 1886, he was talking about it as an age of indecent haste. Could you imagine if he woke up from his grave to the world that we're living in today? If he thought that was haste in 1886, then imagine what he would think of our world now. But the most important takeaway of that piece, and again, for those of you who send Carolyn your email, I can share that text with you so you have it in hand, is that he's teaching us that to read is not to read quickly. Jewish learning, which is called chavruta, chavruta means a friend. In other words, Jewish learning is about a conversation between two people. In our case, it's a conversation amongst the 19 of us that are on the Zoom call, right? So I don't want you to just read the text to yourself, right? But what we're going to do in this exercise is essentially we're going verse by verse, okay? It might be a bit frustrating for some of you, but for others, it's going to open worlds, okay? And you'll begin to understand this process of Jewish learning as we go through it, as we delve into it. Tamara Eskenazi, who wrote the Jewish Publication Society's commentary on the book of Ruth, writes the following of the book that we're learning. She writes very, very beautifully that the story is simple but never simplistic. Like a well-cut gem, this book has many facets that gleam brightly as one turns and turns it again. Its 4 gentle and elegantly crafted chapters profoundly engage difficult issues, such as the complexities of love and loyalty, the challenges of finding bread when one is a widow, a stranger, and a pauper, the nature of responsibility in a time of scarcity, the construction of community, the relation to the other, intermarriage, the redemptive powers of persons, and the role of God in human affairs. All of that in a 4-chapter story. Okay, so hold that as we move forward, and let's talk about Ruth. So Ruth, the book of Ruth, or the scroll of Ruth, is one of 5 scrolls associated with 5 holidays over the course of the Jewish calendrical year. What are the 5 scrolls? Okay, I hope you're taking notes. Okay, Passover is the first festival, the first biblical festival that we have. And the scroll that's associated with Passover is the Song of Songs. Song of Songs, springtime, love is in the air. The next festival after Passover is the holiday of Shavuot. The scroll associated with Shavuot is the scroll of Ruth that we're studying together. After the scroll of Ruth, thinking ahead into the Jewish calendar year, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, in which we commemorate destruction. The destruction of both temples, the first temple and the second temple, and other tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people all throughout history. What scroll do we read? We read the book of Lamentations on the 9th of Av. After the 9th of Av, we have Sukkot. Okay, Sukkot, which is the 3rd biblical festival. Okay, that's our harvest festival in the fall. And Sukkot, we read Kohelet or Ecclesiastes. And then the final, the 5th of the scrolls that we read is the most famous scroll, and that is the scroll that we read on Purim, which is the scroll of Esther. Okay, so those are the 5 scrolls. Now you understand the book of Ruth in its particular context. And each of these scrolls thematically is related to the holiday, right? Of course, Esther, it's obvious, right? Because that is the source of the celebration of Purim. With Ecclesiastes, right, is about the sunset period of our lives, right? And that is as we enter winter, right? So thematically, it fits perfectly, etc. With all of the other Nikilot, with all of the other scrolls that we have. Historically, where is it that we situate the scroll of Ruth? Okay, the scroll of Ruth is understood from its composition, or I should say, the composition of the book leads us to believe, or I should say, not leads us to believe, it wants us to believe that the book was written around the 10th century BCE. Okay, around the 10th century BCE, okay, in the 900s BCE. But we know well from the linguistic clues that were given in the book that it was written about 500 years later. Okay, it was written in the 5th century BCE, in the 400s, okay, which is known as the Persian period or the post-exilic era, okay, post-exile. When is the first exile of the Jewish people? The first exile of the Jewish people is in 587 BCE, when we're expelled by the Babylonians, right, from the land of Israel. Okay, so it's believed that the book of Ruth is written just after the expulsion, right, when the Jews are in Babylonia and around the time of Cyrus of Persia. Okay, so that's historically where it is that we locate ourselves. Okay, now, finally, let's jump into the text. Okay, I know that was a lot of introductory material, but it's all important to understand the background of what we're studying. So you should have in front of you the first chapter of the book of Ruth, which Shirley sent to all of you in PDF form. And let's begin our reading. The background or opening line of this first chapter tells us, in the days when the chieftains ruled, there was a famine in the land. Okay, and right there, okay, we're given a historical clue to the book. Okay, the book itself situates itself b'mei shvot hashoftim, in the time of the book of Judges. What do we know about the book of Judges? Okay, perhaps I should give you that as a homework assignment to read the book of Judges. If you were to read, here are the cliff notes. If you were to read the book of Judges, you would discover that the period of Judges is a very, very chaotic period in Jewish history. Book of Judges is roughly 1200 BCE to 1000 BCE. That's the period of time that we're talking about. It's pre-monarchy. Okay, so it's before the time of King Solomon and before the time of King David. And to sum up the book of Judges, what it's about is it's about these eclectic leaders of the Israelites who rise and fall relatively quickly. And the problem is that politically, it's a very destabilizing time for the Israelites. Okay, there is no consistent leadership. There are these eclectic judges that rise. We could name some of those judges, like Jephthah is a very famous judge. Samson was a judge of Israel. Deborah, one of the most famous judges. Okay, so we have all of these judges, and what happens is the Israelites are not quite punctilious in their observance of Torah. They end up being punished by God. They end up enslaved to foreigners. God raises up a judge or a leader to free them. They become free. They're free for anywhere from 20 to 70 years, and then they fall into the same pattern where they turn away from God, they fall into idolatrous ways. That pattern repeats itself over and over again, all the way till we get to the punchline of the book of Judges. The very, very last book of the book of Judges says the following. Bayamim hahem ein melech b'Yisrael ish hayashav einav ya'aseh. In those days, there was no king over Israel. Everyone simply did according to what was right in their own eyes. That gives you a sense of how chaotic the period was. And I would say also that that is an editorial comment that's added at the end of the book of Judges. What it's doing is it's telling us that that was such a chaotic period that there was a clear need for there to be a monarch over Israel. Right? It's setting the scene for what needs to come, right? That in order for the Israelites to survive, what do they need? They need a king, right? I often say, by the way, that this is parallel to the notion of Zionism and the modern state of Israel. What did the Zionist thinkers do at the end of the 20th century? Right? They thought along similar lines, that we didn't have a state of our own. Right? For the biblical Israelites, the parallel is that they didn't have a king, right? So they didn't have political stability. What do we need as a people in order to survive? We need a state. We need to be sovereign in our own land, right? So there's a very, very parallel process that goes on between what we see way back in ancient Israelite history, as well as what it is that we see today in the modern period. I'm telling you that because that's an important detail that the book is giving us right at the beginning. In other words, this is set against a time of chaos. Okay? It's set against great anxiety. Okay? Echoes of what it is that we're living through in our own. And then to top it all off, chaos. Okay? Thank God we just formed a government finally in Israel, okay? But look at what we're told right at the very beginning of the book. There was a famine in the land, natural disaster, catastrophe. That is a prototypical story for our Israelite ancestors. Can any of you think of another time that famine strikes and our ancestors are motivated to leave the land of Israel? When else does that happen in the Torah, in the book of Genesis specifically? You have to unmute yourself and tell me your name before you speak.
Julie, during the time of Joseph.
Excellent, Julie. Okay, very good. During the time of Joseph? Okay, fantastic. Right? Jacob says to his sons, there's a famine in the land, right? And ultimately, that's how it is that the Israelites end up in the land of Egypt. Give me another time that we're forced to leave, or that our ancestors are forced to leave. Abraham and Sarah. Okay, Abraham, after he hears the call of Lech Lecha and comes into the land of Israel, immediately after he gets to the land of Israel, what happens? There's a famine in the land of Israel. And what do he and Sarah have to do? They have to go down to Egypt, right? That, it seems, is where you go to procure food, right? It was a very, very fertile land, right? Because of the Nile that runs through, right, the length of the country. Okay, so famine is not something that we are strangers to in the tradition, right? But it is setting the story, the author of Ruth is setting this up in the context of other biblical stories. And then we're told, Vayelech ish mi Beit Lechem Yehuda, that a certain man went forth out of Bethlehem in the province of Judah, Lagor b'stei Moab, to go to the fields of, to go to the plain or plains of Moab. Him, his wife, and his 2 sons. Okay, so what did we just learn? Bethlehem. Okay, tell me something about Bethlehem. Where is Bethlehem located? Someone want to chime in? We know what Bethlehem is most famous for.
Birth of Jesus. Birth of Jesus.
Right, yes. Okay, that is what Bethlehem is most famous for. But before being famous, right, for the birth of Jesus, right, it's famous in the Hebrew scriptures, right? Bethlehem comes from the Hebrew Beit Lechem, meaning the house of bread. In Arabic, it's Beit Lahim, which is the house of meat. In other words, it's the house of food. Okay, this is a significant detail too, because they are leaving a house of plenty in the midst of famine, right? Granted, it's a time of famine, okay, but they are leaving a place which is normally a place of blessing, Lagor b'stei Moab, to live in the plains of Moab. Okay, Moab is actually, on a clear day from my balcony, you can see the plains of Moab looking into Jordan. In fact, why not? Just to prove that I'm in Jerusalem, I'm going to show you looking in the direction of Moab. You can't exactly see the hills of Moab because it's hazy today, but I'm going to show you the general direction. Okay, in the distance, on a clear day, I could see down to the Dead Sea from my balcony, and it looks over into the mountains of Moab, which is in Jordan. Okay, as you cross over the Dead Sea, right, that's the area that we're talking about. So what they did is they went from Bethlehem, which is 5 miles south of where I am, 5 miles south of Jerusalem. They went from Bethlehem in that direction that I just showed you. So you can't do this in Boca, Carolyn. If we were sitting in a conference room in Boca, you wouldn't be able to do that. Right? So they go from 5 miles south of where I am in Jerusalem to Moab, the direction that I just showed you. Him and his wife. Okay, now we're given the names of the characters that we're talking about. Okay, now we're told that the name of this person was Elimelech, and the name of his wife is Naomi, and they had 2 sons, Machlon and Chilion, Ephrathites, from the city of Bethlehem, and they came to the plains of Moab to live there. Okay, so we're introduced to the dramatis personae of the story. Okay, let's review these characters, okay? The characters that we have, that we're introduced to in this first chapter, are Elimelech and Naomi. We'll call them the matriarch and patriarch. Their sons, who are called Machlon and Chilion. And in addition to the sons, we have the daughters-in-law. The names of the daughters-in-law are Ruth and Orpah. There's a saying in Hebrew, which comes from the book of Samuel, Kishmo Kenhu, just as one's name, so too is one's essence. The names that we see here are actually literary devices, and they speak to the essence of who each of these characters is. And I want to submit to you that I can assure you that your own Hebrew name, or your own name, as it were, somehow speaks to the essence of who you are. I like to say that our parents were prophets in how it is that they named us, right? It's a remarkable phenomenon, and Jewish tradition teaches us that. So what do I mean by that? Elimelech's name means my God is king. My God is king. Naomi comes from the Hebrew Na'am, which is pleasantness. Machalon, okay, get this one. Now, you don't hear anyone named Machlon and Kilion anymore. And that is, thank God, because Machalon means illness. It comes from the Hebrew Machala. Kilion means ending. Okay, so I mean, who in their right mind would name their sons illness and ending? Lisa, I just saw your hand go up. Unmute yourself, please.
Got it. So why would they name their sons? That would be the obvious question. Did they understand what the meaning of those names were in those days?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Look, one would assume that they understood, the meanings of those names. Now, it's interesting because I read another commentary that seeks to connect the names to other things that are less negative. Okay, that perhaps Machalon is connected to the notion of Mechila, which is forgiveness. Okay, so maybe it's not just Machala, disease, right? Of course, we know how disease fits into this story, how illness fits into this story, because these characters are going to die. But maybe they were thinking forgiveness, right? And Kilion, which is connected to finishing a project, finishing a work of creativity. Okay, and that we know from the book of Genesis, Vayachulu hashamayim v'haaretz. Vayachulu, you hear Kilion. Okay, that's where it comes from. So it could be that those were the meanings that they were thinking of. Okay. Right? The point that I would argue, Lisa, and I'm glad you're asking the question, is that this is a literary device in the story, right? It's setting up this, it's giving us a sense of what is to come. Mm-hmm. Now let's go to the daughters-in-law, Ruth and Naomi. Okay, Ruth and Orpah. Okay, did you know, concerning Orpah, that Orpah's name comes from the Hebrew Oref. We are called Am Kishe Oref. We are a stiff-necked people. She is called Orpah, which means the back of the neck. And why is that? Because when she leaves her mother-in-law, Naomi, she shows Naomi the back of her neck. Right? She turns around, goes in the opposite direction. You're beginning to understand why it is that you have to read this text slowly. Right? And how in every single word there's nuance. Okay, something else connected to Orpah. Did you know that Oprah Winfrey's parents intended to name her Orpah, but got confused, okay, and named her Oprah, right? A little dyslexic about the middle letters there. Okay, that's how she ended, but that's technically who she's named after, Orpah. Okay, Ruth. Most people, if you've been in synagogue on Shavuot, you might hear the rabbi say that Ruth is connected to Re'ut, the Hebrew Re'ut, which means friendship. That is wrong. Okay, instead, Ruth, the name Ruth, is connected. It's also connected to a very, very beautiful notion. It's the root of Ruth, Resh Vav Yud, it means overflowing, as in liquid overflowing, as in kosi rivaya, my cup overflowing. Okay, and why is that? It's because Ruth is a character that overflows with loving kindness. She overflows with chesed. Okay, and there you go. It speaks to her essence. Okay, so you've got, so our names are wrapped up in great meaning, right? We could spend more than an hour going through each of your names. By the way, you're welcome to write to me with your Hebrew name, right? And I can give you a sense of what it means. And then you'll tell me how it reflects your own essence. So moving along at this rapid pace, what happens? Okay, they go off to the plains of Moab, and Elimelech dies there. Okay, actually, before I go on, I'm just looking at the clock. I had said that I was going to stop 45 minutes after the hour for questions. So let me take a couple of questions before I move on. You just have to unmute yourself if you want to ask. Carol? Okay, wait, I think I can help you unmute.
I asked, what's the meaning of Naomi? Oh,
Naomi is
nation?
pleasantness, pleasantness.
Just Naim, okay.
Right, Naim, exactly, pleasantness. When you meet somebody in Israel, you say Naim lahakir, right? It's lovely to meet you. Okay, so that's Naomi, pleasantness. Other questions that you have on anything that I said?
I don't know, can you look into it further that there's in it, a nation that she continues to build a nation, or no? Do they do that or no?
You know what, Carol, that's your drash.
Okay.
And I love it, okay? Because that's also at the essence of what Naomi is all about. She's also about She's about building the people.
Right, that's
Okay, so I love the association. Okay, so in that, you know, even though literally the root of her name is Nun Ayin Mem, still you have the Ayin Mem there. At the heart of her name is the people, and she's the one that's going to bring the people forward. Very nice. Another question or comment? Julie.
I had a question, actually it's going back to regarding the Parsha and leprosy. I thought that the leprosy of the Bible is actually more having to do with Saurus and Lashon Hora, and it's not the leprosy, the skin disease that we know of, you know, in contemporary times, which I think actually makes it more interesting regarding today, because you can touch somebody and physically today and get sick without seeing it and be contaminated, causing you to separate yourself. And if that, in biblical times, it was caused by Lashon Hora, you would think then the coming together and speaking positively would bring us all together and heal us, which is also, I think, relevant to today's times.
Right, beautiful, Julie. I'm glad you said that. The interpretation that you just shared with us is a midrashic interpretation based on the Hebrew mitzurah. Okay, mitzurah is leprous, and what the rabbis say is that it comes from, now you've got to, even if you don't know Hebrew, you can still listen to the similarity. Mitzurah, motzi shem ra, motzi ra, right, which is to bring evil out of your mouth, okay? So that's why the rabbis made that connection, right? They say that what is it that causes this, right? It's gossip, essentially. That's what it is. So in terms of thinking about it today and meaning in our lives, I think you're right. I think that's another notion by which we, and especially with all the vitriol that we're hearing on both sides of the political spectrum, I think it's so important to also think about it in that sense. Okay, it's clear that in terms of the pshat, the literal sense of Torah, it's talking about some sort of skin infection. But midrashically, you're right. That's another connection that we make, that to gossip. Another question or comment? Okay, if not, we're ready to continue. Okay. Vayamot Elimelech. So we're told in verse 3 that Elimelech dies. Ish Naomi, we're told that Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, is the one that dies, and she is left with her two children. And what are we told about the two children? Vayisu lahem nashim moaviot. And they married Moabite women. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. And they settled there and they lived there in Moab for about 10 years. Right? Now, it's interesting. There are a number of different terms that are used for where it is that they're living. The first word, which appears in the first verse, is lagor, which is to sojourn. So at first the text is telling us that they only meant to go to Moab temporarily. They didn't mean to settle there. It was only meant to be a temporary move. Okay, but then it tells us at the end of verse 2, Vayiyu sham, and they were there. And then in this verse that we just read, Vayishvu sham, it seems that their sojourn is becoming a bit longer, a bit more rooted than they had originally intended. And we're told very specifically that they ended up there for 10 years. And then very sadly, what happens is Machlon and Kilion also died. And the woman, that is Naomi, is left there with her daughters-in-law. So we have this mysterious death of the patriarch of the family, Elimelech. We have no idea why it is that Elimelech dies. Again, we have no idea why Machlon and Kilion died. What the rabbis do when they interpret this text is they situate it within a traditional philosophy of theodicy. In other words, right, of a traditional understanding of a quid pro quo world, right, of sin and punishment. Okay, so when Rashi, the great medieval commentator, looks at this text, what is his comment about Elimelech? It's got a fascinating commentary in which he says the following about Elimelech. Because the text says, Vayelech ish, that a man went forth, he says that this is telling us, this is conveying to us that this was a very significant man in the community of Bethlehem, because it refers to him as Ish. Okay? And so Rashi says to us, Asher gadol haya ufarnas hador, that he was a great person in his community, and not only a great person, he was a philanthropist in his community. He supported people in his community. And Rashi goes on to say, Ve'yatsa me'eretz Yisrael lechutz la'aretz, and he left the land of Israel to go to Moab, mipnei tsaru ta'ayin, because of the narrowness of his eyes, which means because of stinginess. What was Elimelech concerned about? He was concerned that the needy in his community would come knocking on his door and that he would be flooded with requests for help. Okay, this is a great point. This is actually a great segue from what Julie said before about our parsha, going between leprosy and gossip. Okay, what Rashi is explaining here obviously is not in the literal sense of the text. Okay, what Rashi is doing is he's trying to understand why all of this loss comes upon this family. Okay, it's a traditional, albeit disturbing theology, okay, that is saying at its essence, you must have done something to deserve this, right? Because why would a family be punished like this? First, the patriarch dies, and then the sons die like this. They must have done something to deserve it, right? And so what does Rashi do along with the other rabbis? They latch on to this idea that it was because he ran away at a time of need. Right? Specifically, when he was most needed in his community, he abandoned ship and leaves. Right? So they paint this portrait of Elimelech as this individualist. Right? He's only concerned about his own skin. Right? And sadly, his sons end up dying too. Another significant piece here as well is the fact that they marry Moabite women. Alan, you got a question there?
I like the simplest interpretation.
I just need you to speak up because I can't hear.
I like the simplest interpretation first, and I see it as a way to move the plot along. You know, that device of death of the people who have to die in order for the next generation, to the next group of people, to enter and to keep the story going. So I'm less concerned in a sense with the death of the two sons and the father, as I am that liberates these people from the bondage of being in this family and starting all over again, all the possibilities that are ahead for them.
Very good. No, that it's an important point that what happens because of the literal sense of what we're seeing here is it liberates Naomi, right? Naomi is the one that becomes the leader of the family now, right? It's this matriarch, right? This is a deeply feminist story, right? And Naomi is now going to make the consequential decisions, not only for her family, but Carol, for the for the people, right? That's who Naomi is going to be making the decisions for as we move forward, okay? So absolutely that literal sense is very important. So we're told that the sons marry these Moabite women, and obviously this alarm should go off in our minds, right? What's going on with this intermarriage here? Okay, and what I want to say to you is that this idea of marrying local nations, other ancient Near Eastern peoples, right, is not exclusive to this text. Okay, we have some other famous biblical characters, right, that intermarry, as it were. Okay, Abraham and Hagar. Hagar is a Mitzri, she's an Egyptian, right? Moses marries Zipporah, and Zipporah is a Midianite, right? Before Moses, Joseph marries Osnat, an Egyptian woman. Okay, so you see that it's not only happening here, but throughout the tradition, we do see that. However, what is particularly striking here is the fact that we're focusing on the Moabite nation. Okay, why do I say that? Where do we first hear about the Moabite nation? What is the root of the Moabite nation? Can anyone remember? Yes.
The Moabites came from the incestuous relationship of Lot and his daughter.
Very good. Excellent. Okay. We're going back to Genesis 19. The origin of the Moabite nation is the incestuous relationship between Lot and his older daughter. Okay, let me read the text to you. Again, this is why I said it's good that you have a Tanakh, Hebrew scriptures beside you as we study together, so you can also go to the same text. I'm going to read it out loud. So what happens after Lot and his family are saved from Sodom and Gomorrah? Right, they settle in the hill. He settles in the hill country with his two daughters. And the older daughter said to the younger daughter, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to consort with us in the way of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father." That night they made their father drink wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father, right? Thus the two daughters of Lot came to be with child by their father. The older one bore a son and named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. And the younger bore a son, and she called him Ben Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites. Later on, these nations become enemies of the Israelites. And then later on in Deuteronomy chapter 23, what is it that we read? Okay, we have another appearance of the Moabites. Okay, listen to what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 23. The following: "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt. Talk about holding a grudge, right? That's quite a long grudge. Okay, but it's because they didn't take care of us. They didn't provide us with food and water when we were desperate. And because they hired Bilam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to heed Bilam. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. Right? It's a pretty shocking statement from the book of Deuteronomy. Do not go anywhere near these people. Right? And yet, what's happening? We have the rehabilitation of the Moabites in the book of Ruth. Right? It's very, very beautiful what's happening here. Okay? It's believed that there's a political agenda that's just under the surface. Lisa, you've got a question.
What is the time period between Ruth and as a Moabite and before, when Lot existed? Like how many generations have passed? Because my thought is when the Israelites decided to disassociate with the Moabites, Ruth was a Moabite, and I just don't know like in where she falls in that category from Lot.
Okay, so Lisa, we're talking about a period of 800 years between them.
Okay.
So the time of Abraham is about 1800 BCE, and the time in which we're situated in the period of Ruth, right? It wants us to believe that it's about 1000 BCE, so about 800 years we're talking about.
Okay.
Okay. The reason that I say there's a political agenda here is because I mentioned to you that it's academically, in terms of biblical criticism and understanding the historicity of the text, it's clearly from the 5th century BCE, which is the Persian period. And why is that significant? Because it's the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And what do we know about Ezra and Nehemiah? Ezra and Nehemiah lead the Israelites back to the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile. Okay, this is the time of Cyrus of Persia. When they come back to the land of Israel, what they want to do, their policy is to expel all foreigners, right? They want to, at essence, purify the Israelites of any foreign influence. And so some academics believe that what's going on in the book of Ruth is this is a diatribe against Ezra and Nehemiah, right? This is a more universal text that is saying to us, wait a moment, right? The idea is not to be insular, but rather we need to be building bridges. You understand why this is such a beautiful, right? That this,
the activity of it, yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's part of what's going on just under the surface.
Thank you.
This is Julie. I've got a question. But if you said that from Lot, we were not supposed to cohabitate or have relations with the Moabites for 10 generations. If this is 800 years later, this is outside the 10 generations.
Right. So look, when the Torah, Julie, says 10 generations, it essentially means forever. It's not just literally counting 10 generations, but it's a pretty emphatic prohibition of associating with these people. And the reason I say that is because also later on in Deuteronomy, it says, forget about it. Do not have anything to do with it. Not only because of what it says in Bereshit, in Genesis, but also because of the fact of how we're treated by them. Okay. What's interesting, Julie, is that the Torah also tells us never again to live in the land of Egypt. That once we leave Egypt, never to go back there. And yet, one of the most prolific and successful Jewish communities in history, right? Where did the Rambam himself live? Maimonides. It was in Egypt, right? The Jews of Egypt were, a model of success and wealth. So even though we have, what is essentially black and white law in Torah, we know well that throughout the ages, there's been flexibility. It hasn't been black and white, right? Many, many shades of gray. I don't know that that's the text I should be quoting right now, shades of gray, but We'll leave it at that. Okay, so after the men died, okay, moving at this rapid pace, we're on verse 6. Okay, we're told that Naomi rises up, vatakom hi v'kaloteha. She and her daughters-in-law get up, vatashav miste Moab, and they return from the plains of Moab, because they heard when they were in the plains of Moab that God had remembered his people to give them bread. In other words, the famine has ended in Bethlehem. And so, right, they heard that the lockdown, the quarantine was being lifted, and they could head back, right, to where they came from. Vatitze min hamakom, and she went out from the place from where she was, that is Naomi, and also her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went along the way to the land of Judah. Okay, so now they're heading back from Jordan, coming back into the land of Israel. Naomi turns to her daughters-in-law and says to her daughters-in-law the following: "Turn back, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband." Right? And she kissed them farewell. Okay? Why does Naomi want her Moabite daughters-in-law to return home? Not a rhetorical question. I want to hear your voices. Why does Naomi urge her daughters-in-law to go back?
They have no opportunity to have children, to have a family, because the men are dead. So she wants them to go on, and it's more likely for them to be successful in their original family unit and that community than in a new unit that may not.
Very good, Lisa. Okay, so number one, maybe this is, it's a very, very unselfish move on the part of Naomi, that she knows that her daughters-in-law won't have a future going back to Bethlehem. So better that they should go back to their native lands. Carol, you wanted to say something? You have to unmute.
I said she has also nothing to offer them, but as you said before, if he left, Elimelech left because he was stingy, she's going back, but she doesn't know how they're going to accept her. Maybe they're going to hold it against her that they left, and she really has nothing to offer them because she's going to be ostracized for having left them, and now they don't need her anymore.
Okay, excellent. Okay, that's a great point. That maybe she's concerned about how the natives of Bethlehem, her old neighbors, are going to receive her. Okay, maybe she expects that they're not going to be so kind to her. Yeah, of course, now in the midst of this revival, she's headed back. Where were you when we needed you? So maybe she's concerned about what the treatment is going to be. Okay, anything else that you're thinking of? Why else would she want them to just go back?
Well, also because they're Moabites.
Very
So
good.
once they're back in Judah or in Israel, they may not be accepted.
Very good. So maybe she's concerned about that. Maybe she's concerned that they won't be accepted, or maybe she's embarrassed that she's going to be in the company of these Moabites, right? As an Israelite woman, here she's coming back with these foreigners. Maybe she herself, that is not such a generous reading of why she might urge them to go back to their homes. Okay, but that's another possibility. Maybe that's part of what she was thinking too. She was concerned about herself, about her own skin. Anything else? Yes.
Debbie has a question also.
Eric.
It's Eric. Hi. I think that the text is really revealing how powerless the women were. After all, Naomi's husband owned property. She can't go back and make a claim to it. The women only can have property through a Levirate marriage. Yes, a Levirate marriage of future progeny of Naomi. At point after point, the women are impoverished because of their gender.
Very good. Excellent, excellent, excellent point. Okay. I am going to explain probably next class what Levirate marriage is. Okay, it's a very, very important notion in the book that we're going to get to. But the point that I want to latch onto right now is the notion of the powerlessness of the women here. Okay, and that's
Just 1 second. I think Alan also had a question.
Yes, hi. I think I would look at this also as a test. If these daughter-in-laws
louder.
see it as a test, perhaps she is saying, look, they have a chance to come with me. They were, after all, the wives of my sons. Let's see what happens if I offer them, go back, do what you have to do. Who's going to make the decision to, again, move the plot? So Naomi's the one who passed the test. I'm sorry, Ruth is the one who passed the test.
That's very interesting. So maybe it's a test, and maybe she was, you know, I would call it speaking Jewish, right? Like a Yiddish Bobby. Don't worry, I'll sit in the dark. Let me go back. I will suffer, okay? That, you know, we sort of hear that. I love Shirley's chuckling right now. I could hear it, Shirley, even though you're on mute, right? That, you know, this is what's going on here. Maybe that's what she was doing here. She was testing them to see, right? Shirley, yeah.
I think it's the original mother-in-law martyr guilt trip. I do.
The original mother-in-law martyr guilt trip, okay? And just, you know, connected to what was said before, yes, these women are powerless, okay? And when Naomi says, may the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband, you've got to understand the time that we're living in, right? How is it that we define security in this period? It's in relation to being protected by a husband, right? And you know, as was pointed out before, that, you know, that's the connection to land, that's the connection to property, and this is her concern. So if I have to err in one exegetical direction or another, I would err on the side that I want to believe Naomi is being unselfish in this moment and urging them to go back. But then again, maybe she is embarrassed by them going back to Bethlehem with these Moabite women, right? Or maybe this is, you know, as we're pointing out, maybe this is a test. What I do want you to see here is the structure of what's happening. Naomi urges the women, her daughters-in-law, 3 times to go back. This is the first time that we just read, okay? And then we're told, after the first time, after she urges them the first time, she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, this is verse 10, no, we will return with you to your people. Okay, so you hear the voices of Ruth and Orpah saying that in unison. But then in verse 11, Naomi presses them a second time, right? And says, Shovna binotai, right? Go back, my daughters. Lama telechna imi, ha'od li vanim b'ma'ai? Do I still have the capacity to give birth? Right? This is an allusion to Levirate marriage that we're going to talk about next class. You know, so that's the second time. And then the third time that she urges them to go back is verse 12. Shovna binotai, lechna, turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore children, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you, on their account, debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me. By the way, that is what the rabbis base the halakha, the Jewish law, on, that when a convert, potential convert, comes to you to convert, what does a rabbi do traditionally? Turns them away 3 times, tries to turn them away 3 times, right? But the last time when they come back, you know, you cave in, that's it. You know, obviously that person is determined. This is where it comes from. This is what they're basing the source on, right? Very, very beautiful. I saw a hand or two go up.
I what I was going to comment on. And of course, Ruth is the paradigm for the convert, for somebody who is so important to the Jewish people and so valued. And I think that this is a story that reminds us again and again that someone who makes a decision to become a Jew by choice doesn't even really need, in my opinion, doesn't need to keep saying that. I am a convert. I hear it so many times from people who have converted or called themselves a Jew by choice. No, they're not. Once they make that decision,
That's right. That's right.
They never have to explain themselves.
That's right.
Explain themselves, and I don't think they should.
Right. So that's why I always say either, right, there's no distinction, period, or we view all of ourselves, as Jews by choice, right? Because like I said, you've got to make a proactive decision, take hold of learning, take hold of community in order to consider yourself a true Jew, in order to, you've got to be a part of the story. So moving on, the last verse that I read, since I always say every translation is a commentary. In the English translation you have in front of you, in Naomi's mouth it says, "Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours." In the Hebrew, it says, "Ki mar li ma'od mikem," that I am bitter because of you. Okay? There's a big difference there. Okay, so maybe that would reinforce the, Lisa?
My translation also says, no, my daughters, I am very bitter on account of you.
On account of you, that would be enough, right, exactly.
Yeah, because God has gone against me, because.
Okay, so two important things there. One is one interpretation for us is that maybe that's how we have to understand it. I'm bitter on account of you, because of you, number one. Number two, she is a very traditional thinker in terms of relationship with God and theology, right? She says, "Ki yatsa vi yad Adonai," that the hand of God has come out against me. Okay, it's that the hand of God has struck me. Right, that's a very, very powerful theological statement that she's saying here. Right, this wasn't by accident, but she herself believes that she did something to deserve this. Somewhere along the way that things went awry. So we're told that they broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell. Okay, so Orpah leaves, again, turns her neck, turns her back to her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Okay, the Ruth dovka ba. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." Okay, what do you think is the motive for this unilateral and permanent commitment that Ruth is making here? Why is she making this declaration? This is a very dramatic declaration for the Moabite daughter-in-law to be making here.
Maybe.
Carol, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Maybe she believes that Naomi feels that she is being punished, and she wants her, and Ruth wants to be with her to show her that she is not going to be punished, and she will stick by her side, and whatever she has to go through to return, she will be by her side no matter what. Maybe she was a great mother-in-law to her. Maybe she was the quiet wife and did everything her husband wanted to do or what her sons wanted to do. And she has all this pent up in her, all the years that she was quiet and went along and went to another country with her husband, let her sons marry whoever they want. And now she was being punished for everything. And Reut is saying, you are not going to be punished. I'm going to be by your side, and I will be with you and go through everything with you till the day you die, because because you are an unbelievable person.
Beautiful. That's a lovely and generous reading of what's going on here. That Ruth is being selfless here. Yeah.
I also think that the
Nice and loud.
declaration of belonging, not only to Naomi, but also to her people, is a way of saying that I'm going to follow, and my children and my children's children, whichever children I have, will continue to be Jews. I have made that declaration. So wherever life takes her, she has made the decision to put her lot in with the Jewish people and guarantee that her progeny will continue to be Jews.
That's right. It's not just about her own life, but this is about her descendants. This is about future generations that we're talking about here. So it's this very, very selfless move on the part of Ruth here, right? I love that notion of her being so deeply connected to her mother-in-law and seeing her mother-in-law finally become empowered in this moment, right? And that's a great way of looking at this text too, that at first she's the appendage that's just dragged along by Elimelech, but who knows what was going on behind the scenes? Maybe it was Naomi that was trying to convince her husband to stay in Beit Lechem, right? Why do we have to leave? You know, it'd be so interesting to hear her voice in this, right? And the text goes out of its way at the very beginning of this first chapter to say specifically that he was the one who made the decision. He left, and his wife and his 2 sons accompanied him. Okay, so I think that's a great way of understanding it. You know, all of a sudden Naomi is beginning to be empowered, and Ruth is going to reinforce that. And part of what's interesting too here is what it says in verse 18, Vatere ki hi mitametzet hi, lelechet ita, that when Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, Naomi ceased to argue with Ruth. And the 2 went on until they reached Bethlehem. Okay? So what do we make of Naomi's silence at this point? How are we to understand her simply falling silent and just going ahead with Ruth's wish?
I think she just acquiesced. She's like, okay, that's it. It's done. I tried to stop her. I'm not going to stop her anymore. I'm not going to try anymore.
Okay, maybe she just acquiesces here.
Just as you said, we don't know what Naomi was doing back in Bethlehem when the famine was happening. We don't really know about Ruth's history either. Maybe she was not so well received in the Moabite family or people she came from.
Right, right, very true. We know nothing about Ruth's background, and maybe, right, who knows what was going on in her family of origin, right? So, you know, perhaps there was nothing to lose on her part. So it was both a push and a pull, perhaps. Okay, so it could be that the silence is acquiescence. Yep.
I love the idea that the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law walk hand in hand into whatever destiny will connect them. I think it's a really life-affirming statement on how mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws can be successful, happy, and loving.
You hear that, Tabitha? You chose well. I love that. And it's not only the redemption of the Moabites that we see here, but it's also the redemption of the mother-in-law, the image of the mother-in-law that's happening here, right? And that, you know, the whole quality and nature of the relationship should really be modeled off of what it is that we're seeing here between Naomi and Ruth. So I want to wrap up on that note. I think that's a very, very beautiful note to wrap up on. It's hard for me to believe that it's been 90 minutes already. For me, here in Israel, it's flown by, and I hope most, if not all of you, can say the same. And I'm already looking forward to our next session. So Carolyn, I want to give you the last word.
So I just really, Shirley, I want to thank you for initiating.
Thank you.
Bertha, I want to thank you for teaching. You really filled our morning with learning, and you gave us a real sense of stability and security, knowing that Jewish people, really all people, have endured times of challenge. This certainly is now, and gives us faith to know it's going to be okay. Mark your calendar. We're going to learn again on April 30th. I hope you will all join us. And Shirley, I'll give you the last word.
I want to thank everyone.
Can't hear you, Shirley.
Sorry, Shirley, you're kind of breaking up.
Okay, but hopefully we'll get Shirley back. But I just want to say that next class, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up from the middle of verse 19 when they arrive in Bethlehem, and we'll go forward into the second chapter. Okay, so
Thank you very, very much. It was fabulous. This is great.
I don't know why. Thank everybody. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Shirley.
you.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful learning with you. Thank you very much, Matt.
Thanks.
Take care. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. להתראות, everybody.
להתראות.
Call two.
In person.
תודה רבה.